As you know, I spend a lot of time covering the civilizations of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, most of which has been focused on Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt. However, to the west of these lie the Zagros Mountains, which extend for 1,600 kilometers, or nearly 1,000 miles, from the southern deserts of Iran to southwestern Anatolia. While most of this mountain range lies within the confines of western and southern Iran, smaller but significant parts also extend beyond the Iranian border into Iraq and Turkey. Unlike with most of Mesopotamia and the eastern Mediterranean, the Bronze and early Iron Age history of this region, at least until the advent of the Achaemenid Empire, has not been studied in as much detail. This has given many the impression that not much was going on here during the early years of antiquity. On the contrary, due to many of the artifacts that have been discovered throughout the Zagros range, a lot was going on in this region before it became part of the Achaemenid Empire. Unfortunately, the people who lived here didn't have any known form of writing, and so we can only make informed assumptions of what their lives may have been like from the relatively few ruins and artifacts that have been uncovered. In fact, the only writing about the peoples inhabiting these mountains comes from the literate civilizations just to the east in Mesopotamia. Some of the earliest Sumerian texts between 2900 to 2500 BC seem to indicate that resources such as copper, tin, and precious stones came from the region of the Zagros Mountains and beyond. A few centuries later, most notably during the reign of the Akkadian king Naram-Sin, between the years 2254 to 2218 BC, we get the names of a few tribes that lived there, the most famous being the Lulubi, who were ruled by a king named Satuni. Believed to have come from the Zagros Mountains, they're depicted on the famous victory stela of Naram-Sin. In general, the urban dwellers of ancient Mesopotamia looked down upon the inhabitants of the mountains along their eastern borders as a great nuisance. The Lulubi were one such people, and Naram-Sin may have been punishing them for their attacks on what was at the time the frontiers of the Akkadian Empire. Interestingly, later Neo-Sumerian and Babylonian texts traditionally attribute the end of the Akkadian Empire to another mountain people, the Gutians. In the Neo-Sumerian literary work, The Curse of Agade, written a few centuries after the reign of Naram-Sin, the Gutians are described as a people who know no inhibitions, with human instincts, but canine intelligence, and monkey's features. Whether or not the Gutians actually brought about the downfall of Akkadian civilization in the Dark Age that followed is hotly debated amongst scholars. But virtually all Sumerian and Babylonian texts describe them using derogatory words. Another group believed to have come from the Zagros Mountains were the Kassites. First entering Mesopotamia as migrant workers, by the 16th century BC, a Kassite dynasty had established itself as the rulers of most of Babylonia. In power for around 400 years, the Kassites ruled over Babylon and the nearby cities longer than any other dynasty. And yet, we know little about them or their mountain ancestors. In fact, no artifact that can be definitively identified as being Kassite has ever been found in their homeland, whichever part of the Zagros Mountains that may have been. The same mysteries seem to also be true of the many Iron Age peoples and kingdoms that appear in the annals of later Assyrian kings. The names of some of them found in these texts, most of which would be unknown to us otherwise, include the Mania, Ilipi, Kilzanu, Mada, and Parsua. Based on information from the Assyrian archives, listing tribute or spoils of war from military campaigns against them, these people had horses, livestock, camels, and objects crafted out of copper, bronze, silver, gold, and lapis lazuli. However, because none of these peoples, or the small states they formed, left behind any discernible form of writing, we can only guess at their exact locations due to what little is mentioned of them in Assyrian texts. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Assyrian records barely reveal the tip of the iceberg. There have been many different cultures living in this region, dating back several thousand years. In this program, we'll delve deeper into the little-known history of these mysterious peoples who once occupied the Zagros Mountains. Though the earliest presence of humans in western Iran goes back to the Paleolithic era, we're going to jump forward in time to around 5000 to 4000 BC, which was during the Chalcolithic or Copper Age. It's at sites such as Haji Firuz Tepe, Dalma Tepe, Yanik Tepe, Tepegian, Godin Tepe, Ganjdare, and a few other sites that archaeologists uncovered distinct styles of painted pottery and small figurines dating back to at least 7,000 years ago. Covered with images of various geometric patterns and animals, especially the ibex and various birds, they show some semblance to artifacts dated to around the same period in northern Mesopotamia, indicating the movement of peoples between that area and the mountains of western Iran. This type of pottery would be the main form of artistic expression in much of the Zagros Mountains for the next few millennia. Many of these sites also contained copper tools such as chisels and axes. By around 3000 BC, small, button-shaped stamp seals became relatively common amongst several prehistoric sites throughout the Zagros range. Since we know that such seals were used throughout the Near East to authenticate goods and their sender, this may indicate some form of regional trade, most likely with Mesopotamia to the west and the lowlands of Elam to the south. One site of interest was Godin Tepe, where clay tablets with Proto-Elamite markings have been uncovered. It's even been hypothesized that a Proto-Elamite trading post may have existed in or around Godin Tepe. Between 2500 to 2000 BC, around the time that most of western Iran entered into the Bronze Age, several of the known early Copper Age sites were still occupied, but evidence suggests that people from the north migrated into this region and transformed many of these earlier settlements in the process. The new arrivals are called by scholars the Transcaucasian Bronze Age culture, also sometimes known as the Yanik culture, and their influence can be seen in the new types of pottery and housing layouts that appear in some parts of northwestern Iran. Though there's little evidence of any violence during their migration, their arrival in the region coincides with the eventual abandonment of some sites, such as Yanik Tepe, after which the culture was actually named. Other areas, though, either didn't come in contact with such people or maintained their original culture, such as the people of Godin Tepe, which remained occupied until at least 1400 BC. Another notable late Bronze Age site that seems to have been occupied for extended periods of time into the early Iron Age is Dinka Tepe, located in northwestern Iran near Lake Urmia, or Urmiye. There, archaeologists working from the 1930s to the 60s discovered that there had once been a massive fortification wall, perhaps dating to the Bronze Age, over which a later Iron Age settlement had been built. Burials with grave goods, mostly pottery, but also weapons such as spears and daggers, were discovered throughout the site. What's unique about the Iron Age settlement is that the older style of pottery and ceramic ware, which is similar to the style found throughout northern Mesopotamia, is almost completely replaced with another kind typical of northern Iran, southwestern Anatolia, and the southern Caucasus region. This new type of pottery, which started to appear at sites such as Dinka Tepe between 1000 to 900 BC, was unique for the shape of its sprouted vessels and pedestal-based goblets with side handles. The change is stark and seems to imply that, like at Yanik Tepe centuries earlier, a new culture had arrived at Dinka Tepe and the nearby site of Haji Firuz. It's also more evidence of constant migration and change taking place throughout western Iran in antiquity. Just to the east of Dinka Tepe is the site of Hasanlu Tepe, or simply Hasanlu. Of all the early Iron Age sites, Hasanlu is one of the most impressive, and perhaps also the most tragic. One summer day, around 800 BC, just south of what's today Lake Urmia in Iran, a hostile army appeared on the edges of a moderately sized city. What its name was so long ago is unknown, but today, the locals called the mound covering its present-day ruins Hasanlu Tepe. Within the city were temples, the homes of its citizens, a palace, and a citadel. However, most of these buildings had been abandoned. The vast majority of the city's residents had fled to the great citadel, hoping that its strong walls would protect them from the invaders. They wouldn't. When the walls were finally breached, the hapless people trapped inside were greeted by a barrage of arrows, followed by the slashes of swords and stabbing from spears. Perhaps when there were few left to slaughter, the invading soldiers set the citadel on fire, which, due to the hot summer wind fanning its flames, quickly spread throughout the entire complex. The wooden columns holding up the ceiling began to disintegrate amongst the flames, and eventually, the entire ceiling crashed, crushing those who may have thought they were safe within the parts of the citadel that had yet to be breached. But the invading soldiers had acted too hastily, for they didn't realize that within the temples and citadel there were valuable objects made of bronze, silver, and gold. A few days later, after the fires had all but died down, some of the enemy soldiers seemed to have returned and searched through the ash and rubble for more objects to loot. Loading whatever they found that could be carried on their pack animals, they eventually left, leaving behind at least 285 charred bodies amongst the once lively city's ruins. This is basically the story that archaeologists have pieced together from years of excavations at the site of Hasanlu. Though there's no written account of the tragedy, archaeologists, digging for over 10 seasons, have collected so many artifacts, as well as examined the burned remains of the site and other evidence in such detail that a narrative like this seems quite plausible. Generally, when people abandon a place, they take anything useful or of value along with them. But for the people of Hasanlu, who had to flee both enemy soldiers and fire, such objects were left behind and ended up being preserved under the collapsed debris for millennia until they were dug up by archaeologists in the 1960s. Despite the looting and burning, the foundations of many of the city's buildings are still very much intact. There was a complex of 5 massive, multi-roomed buildings surrounding a large, stone-paved court. Approximately 1,400 to 1,500 square meters each, the buildings had large, central wooded columned halls with a large hearth or perhaps altar in the middle. The walls were lined with benches with what seems to have been a raised throne area at one end. Around these were smaller rooms that may have been used for storage. The buildings also seemed to have been multi-storied, as they had stairways that led to a second floor. It's been speculated that at least one of these buildings was a palace belonging to the city's king, or at least a place where a ruling council may have met. These and other structures at Hasanlu are the first known columned buildings to have ever been discovered in Iran. Eventually, this became the characteristic building plan of the Medes and later the Persians, as can be seen at the later sites of Pasargadae and Persepolis. Such complex and massive buildings, along with the plethora of artifacts found at Hasanlu and its cemeteries, show that this was a city of great wealth, with skilled artisans, architects, and a merchant class that traded with the great polities to the west, including the kingdom of Urartu and the more powerful Neo-Assyrian Empire. It's not exactly sure what the mainstay of Hasanlu's economy was, but it's believed that it had something to do with horse breeding. Assyrian annals tell of trading with the people of western Iran, or simply raiding them for the main purpose of acquiring horses. One of the most interesting parts of Hasanlu was what seems to have been the city's main temple within the citadel. Called Burn Building 2 by the archaeologists excavating it, over 1,500 objects were uncovered from this section of the city. Temples were generally storehouses for valuable objects and offerings, and usually amongst the first places to be looted during an enemy attack. But in this case, it's likely that the temple was set on fire before it could have been looted, hence the great number of valuable artifacts still remaining within the sanctuary's burned walls. Other areas, which must have been storerooms, contained thousands of beads, ivory furniture, glazed tiles, glass, and other objects made of gold and silver. Several of the items were inscribed with the names of kings from Assyria, Babylonia, and Susa. Rather than being spoils of war, these objects were gifts and offerings to the temple, possibly from other kings and allies as a gesture of goodwill. It also makes clear that Hasanlu was part of a much larger world, which unfortunately due to its location, may have got it unintentionally caught up in the region's politics, especially between the two great regional powers of Assyria and Urartu. This then brings us to the question, who was responsible for attacking and setting Hasanlu ablaze? There are several hypotheses that have been proposed to answer this question. In the 9th century BC, Hasanlu was located at the crossroads of trade routes that meandered through the Zagros Mountains. As the two largest regional powers, namely Assyria and Urartu, expanded further to the east and south, respectively, Hasanlu would have been a profitable ally or acquisition for either of them. These states, though, wouldn't have been the only players in the region. There were plenty of smaller kingdoms in nearby Anatolia, the southern Caucasus Mountains, and northern Iran that could have also had issues with the people of Hasanlu. The archaeologists who first excavated at Hasanlu believed that it was likely the Urartians who had destroyed the city. As we've seen, several objects from Assyria and Mesopotamia, presumably gifts, were found in the Citadel Temple's treasury and storerooms, and so Hasanlu may have been an Assyrian vassal, or at least on good terms with its rulers. Perhaps the Urartians, the mortal enemies of Assyria, may have sought to punish Hasanlu for its Assyrian ties. Or perhaps Hasanlu had once belonged to Urartu and were being punished for rebelling or switching sides. Or the Urartians could have simply been expanding southward, and Hasanlu was in their way. Evidence of a later Urartian fortress has been found at Hasanlu, which lends support to this idea. The type of weaponry used also seems to come from the north, especially several spiked mace heads that are uncharacteristic of the locally made weapons found at Hasanlu. It should be noted, though, that Urartian soldiers weren't the only ones who used such weapons. There were other peoples of the South Caucasus who could have also ventured south to wealthy Hasanlu simply to loot the city of its treasures. The reverse, though, could also have been true. Maybe the Assyrians had come to punish Hasanlu due to it being an Urartian ally. After all, the level of brutality that the Assyrian army often employed to deal with its enemies, especially rebels, is well known and seems to at least match that of what occurred at Hasanlu. However, the evidence on this is shaky, and with the exception of Assyrian-style pointy helmets, which could have really belonged to anyone, there's no material evidence that the Assyrians were indeed responsible. But they could have had local allies to do the job for them. Though archaeologists are constantly re-evaluating many of the artifacts and their hypotheses based upon them, no smoking gun as to who the perpetrators were has ever been found. In 1947, a shepherd in the Zagros Mountains of Iran claimed to have discovered a bronze casket filled with objects made of pure gold, silver, bronze, ivory, and clay below the ruins of the ancient citadel of Ziwiye. However, these objects weren't of just one civilization, but several. There were artifacts that were clearly Assyrian, Urartian, Scythian, and perhaps even Median. The style of the others was less clear, but they may have been manufactured locally. Clear to the archaeologists, though, were that these were some of the finest Iron Age artifacts ever to have been discovered in Iran. Collectively known as the Ziwiye Hoard, many of them were quickly put on the antiquities market and sold to museums and private collectors. There were problems, though, with the so-called hoard and whether or not the objects even came from Ziwiye. In 1964, an expedition led by the University of Pennsylvania uncovered a staircase belonging to the ruins of Ziwiye's citadel, and though bits of pottery were discovered, nothing remotely similar to the objects of the so-called Ziwiye Hoard were ever found. Later excavations in the 1970s in other parts of the citadel yielded virtually the same result. And so, whether or not the items actually came from Ziwiye, and to who they may have actually belonged to, remain a mystery. In the center of the Zagros Mountains in western Iran is the area today known as Luristan. Here, thousands of ancient bronze tools, weapons, utensils, votive objects, and ornaments were discovered during the first half of the 19th century. Though supposedly coming from the mountains of Luristan, in truth, nobody really knew where these objects came from because most of them had been gathered from various ancient cemeteries that were never documented. The artifacts simply appeared on the antiquities market. As Western demand for these seemingly priceless objects grew, some locals even crafted their own and sold them off as ancient relics to unsuspecting Western archaeologists and museums. Serious excavations of the region commenced in 1938, when archaeologist Erich Schmidt led excavations around the site of Sur Qudum in Luristan. A few decades later, in the mid-1960s, the Belgian archaeological mission in Iran resumed digging at Sur Qudum, spending 15 seasons there until 1978. Along with the multi-roomed building complex, believed to have been some sort of temple sanctuary, over 1,850 bronze and terracotta artifacts of a relatively unknown artistic style were discovered. Along with figurines in the shapes of humans and animals, there were also those believed to have been depictions of deities, demons, and other supernatural figures. Similar objects were also found in nearby graves. Most of them seem to date to the 8th or 7th century BC, but several are from a few centuries earlier. Though many thousands of mainly bronze objects have now been discovered throughout Luristan, they unfortunately provide very limited information about the people who created them. The abundance of such objects, though, is evidence that their owners came from a wealthy society that was both seemingly militaristic but also very spiritual. Did the earliest objects from this region belong to the Lulubu, the Gutians, the Kassites, or some other unknown people and their descendants? And what exactly happened to them? And what about the more recent ones? Were they some sort of Proto-Median group or other Indo-Iranian group that we don't know of? Archaeology is definitely not an exact science. What we do know, without doubt, is that by the 6th century BC, people speaking Indo-European languages were present in the region, and probably by then made up the majority of the population. The most famous of these, of course, were the Medes and the Persians. After the fall of the Assyrian Empire, the Medes took up the mantle of leadership in the Zagros Mountains and beyond to found an extensive empire of their own that basically occupied all of the areas that we went over in this program. They were of course followed by the Persians, of which we know much more about due to writings and inscriptions in Old Persian, Akkadian language texts from Babylon, Elamite administrative tablets, and Aramaic correspondence during the time that the Achaemenid dynasty ruled over western Iran and the entire Zagros range. Thanks so much for watching. I'd really like to thank GrandKek69, Jaap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Danielle Allen, Danny Van Eck, WNXTV, Robert Morgan, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Hurtado Correa, Michael Trudell, John Scarberry, Franz Robbins, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Anahita Debu, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Cy on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Cy podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.